warm welcome to the MUFG Latin America podcast. This is Mauricio, and today we will talk about the macroeconomic outlook for Latin America in 2020. Carlos Pedroso and Mauricio Nakahodo, or economists at MUFG Brazil, have joined me to share their updated views on the region's economic prospects. Carlos, the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting the global economy and Latin America is no exception. How are the Latin countries dealing with the pandemic and what has been the impact on the region?
The pandemic has hit the rural region hard, but there were significant differences in conditions among Latin countries before this health crisis began. And likewise, now we are seeing different responses across the region. Prior to the pandemic, political tensions were high in countries like Chile, Colombia, and Peru, and economies were already in recession in Mexico and Argentina. Brazil was a somewhat different story. The economy was gradually recovering and had good prospects due to the progress that was being made on the structural reforms. But this scenario changed as soon as the COVID-19 pandemic hit, when Brazil became one of the most affected countries in the region. Government responses to the outbreak have been very different in different countries. In Mexico and Brazil, government measures have been more modest, unlike what has been seen in Chile, Peru, Colombia, and even Argentina. In general, these initiatives have taken the form of investments in the public health system as they aim to improve health services to the population. They also provide support to businesses to help them avoid bankruptcy, preserve employment as much as possible, and transfer some cash to the poorest segments of the population. The problem is that in most of these cases, governments have been much less active in Latin than in advanced economies because there is more limited room for fiscal measures. The post-pandemic scenario is a concern because these economies will emerge from this crisis more fragile than they were before. Economies will be in recession, impoverished, indebted, with higher unemployment and new jobs difficult to come by, both because the low economic activity and because many companies, especially small and medium-sized ones, will have gone bankrupt. Thus, the recovery will be gradual, and 2021 growth will not fully offset the 2020 downturn. In the region, economies with better macroeconomic fundamentals like Chile, Peru, and Colombia might recover fast, while Brazil and Mexico might lag behind. Certainly, given the debt restructuring situation, Argentina might be the last to recover.
How is Brazil being affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and what are the GDP prospects?
There has been a sharp escalation of the COVID-19 outbreak in Brazil. And along with the quarantine period of social distancing measures, some local governments have decided to impose lockdowns. The scenario is quite gloomy, and there is a significant risk that such measures will have to be maintained for a prolonged period. Our previous forecast of a gradual lifting of quarantines starting in June in most parts of Brazil has become unlikely in light of recent trends in the epidemic in Brazil. In this scenario, even the IMF's estimates of a 5.3% GDP contraction has a downward bias, considering the 12% contraction that we expect for the second quarter and a slower pace of recovery over the second half of the year. We expect 7.4% GDP contraction for this whole year. The government has announced an ample set of measures designed to provide financial support to the most vulnerable families and to businesses. However, the worse the pandemic scenario, the more negative the socio-economic impact will be in terms of higher unemployment, discouraged workers, and business closures in various sectors.
Mauricio, what about Mexico? What is the current situation there and how is the government responding?
The López Obrador administration has been facing criticism for its sluggish fiscal response to the pandemic. The fiscal package focused on cash transfer to the poorest people and moving forward with infrastructure investments as a way to create jobs. The IMF expects a GDP contraction of 6.6% for this year, which would be deeper than the so-called tequila crisis contraction in 1995, when GDP dropped by 6.3%. This prospective GDP decline is being driven by three major factors. First, the lockdowns aimed at curbing the pandemic. Second, the decline in trade, direct investments, and wage remittances stemming from the GDP contraction in the United States, which has been estimated at 5.9% by the IMF. And third, the effect of a sharply lower oil price on Pemex's already fragile financial situation, which will necessitate further capital injections from the Mexican Treasury and put further pressure on the fiscal accounts. We would also note that fiscal balance has been affected by decline in tax collection amid the recession, and in such a scenario, Mexico runs the risk of losing its investment-grade status in the medium to long run.
And what about the impact of the pandemic in Chile and the government response there?
Chile's economic outlook was already gloomy before the pandemic, amid street protests and the process of rewriting the constitution. The pandemic is taking a big hit on economic activity via the containment measures needed to curb the outbreak and the impact of global recession on the Chilean exports. The IMF projects a contraction of 4.5% this year. On the positive side, the PNR administration response, aimed at boosting healthcare spending and supporting households and businesses, was quick and among the most ambitious in Latin America, being estimated at 7.2% of GDP. There has been some easing of tensions with the Congress, which rapidly approved this ample fiscal stimulus package, and the referendum on constitutional reform scheduled for April was postponed to October.
Looking to the Andean economies, how do you see Peru and Colombia?
Well, Peru and Colombia have strong macroeconomic fundamentals. Both are rated investment grade by the rating agencies, but Peru gets better marks than Colombia. With Peru's relatively low ratio of gross debt to the GDP at 26%, the authorities there have more room to implement a more meaningful aid program to mitigate the impact of the disease on the country. Nevertheless, the IMF still forecasts a 4.5% drop in the GDP for Peru. Colombia is facing a double shock: the coronavirus outbreak and the low oil prices. Additionally, Colombia started the crisis in a weaker fiscal position with gross debt at around 55% of GDP. Besides the fiscal impacts of the aforementioned issues, Colombia's fiscal accounts have been affected by costs associated with the immigration from Venezuela. Although the IMF expects Colombia's GDP to contract by only 2.4%, among the lightest impact in the region, its emergence from the crisis will still be challenging, as the country needs to address its fiscal balance.
And Argentina, how will we deal with the coronavirus together with the debt restructuring?
Regarding Argentina, it's a very particular case. The country was plunged into the coronavirus crisis after having already endured 2 years of recession, and just as it was poised to present a debt restructuring plan devised by the new administration that took off in last September. Even before the latest crisis, negotiations with investors were expected to be tough, and after the outbreak and the consequent increase in government needs, the situation became unsustainable. The country officially entered its 90th external debt default when it didn't pay $500 million in interest payment after the 30-day grace period expired. From a fiscal point of view, Argentina looks very fragile. The recession is damaging tax collection. The small local security market doesn't provide enough funding to finance the treasury, and there is no access to external market. And yet, there is still a need to increase the expenditures because of the coronavirus. The economy will suffer sharply, and the IMF forecasts GDP plunging by 5.7% this year, the third consecutive year of contraction. Argentina's situation is very challenging, and its exit path from this crisis is still far from clear.
We hope you have enjoyed this conversation. Thanks to Carlos and Mauricio for joining us, and thank you all for listening.